Welcome to a fuck knows how many parts series wherein I am going to babble about my books, where I was at the time when I was writing them, and pretty much whatever the fuck comes to mind. I promise no editing or minimal editing because I can't be bothered, and if any of this is cohesive, it'd be a fucking miracle. All right, so we are going to start with 88. This is the first book I ever wrote, the cover of which will appear maybe up there, or maybe up there. I don't know. I'm going to figure out how to paste that in later. At the time, I was working in live sound in downtown Toronto. I was the house sound tech and booking agent at a club called Clinton's, Bloor and Clinton Street. We did dance nights, we had live bands, there were comedy nights, there were poetry nights. It's weird when you achieve sort of what you think is your dream, eventually it becomes a job. Working in music had for a long time been a dream for me, and then I started doing it, and after about 15 years and kind of ballpark mixing about 10,000 live bands, I was getting pretty tired of it. I wanted to change. I wanted to do something else. And so I decided I was going to write a best-selling science fiction novel and become an author. I read Snow Crash somewhere in there. That's Neil Stephenson, and blew my brain. I was absolutely in love with it. And I basically set out to write my own version of Snow Crash. So it was a cyberpunk novel, research heavy because I didn't know anything about anything and mostly still don't. I had previously tried to write books many times throughout the 90s. I think 93, 94 was probably the first time I tried to write a book. That book was called Blackstone Heart. And I couldn't finish it. I think I wrote maybe 60,000 words, and then it turned out that writing a novel was difficult and required effort, and I bailed. That happened several times. I have 3, I think, partial novels written from that era. They are pretty awful. And then somewhere around 2006, 2007, I snapped. I decided I was going to finish a novel no matter what. And so I sketched out a very rough idea for a cyberpunk novel. Oddly, this was based on a drunken weekend in Matamoros, Mexico with a bunch of friends. That's weird. So we found a car rental place that would rent to us. We were all, 20-ish. Unlimited mileage for a long weekend. And the actual daily rental was not much. So we rented a car for a long weekend. We drove from Southern Ontario, London, Ontario to be exact. We drove from London, Ontario to the Gulf of Mexico. We stopped to get very drunk along the way. We walked out into the Gulf of Mexico, got our feet wet, drove into Matamoros, realized that we were probably somewhere we didn't belong, got the fuck out of there. We stayed in Matamoros long enough to buy huge sombreros and ponchos, and I still have mine somewhere, I think. And then we drove back to London, Ontario. While in Matamoros, I noticed that there were dentistry clinics, dentistry surgeons everywhere. And it just struck me as very strange how many dental places there were. And that kind of triggered this thought, what would it be like if sort of neural surgery became as common as these sort of fairly high-end looking dental clinics? Out of that came this idea for scanning human minds, it being a destructive process, and eventually the rest of the story that was the book 88. My first draft, which took me about 2 years to write because I was still working a full-time job, was third person present tense. And it was glorious. The action scenes were amazing. Present tense works so well for action. However, it doesn't work so well for some other stuff. I finished up writing that first draft. I think it was in, I want to say 2008, while on my honeymoon with my wife. And she didn't come me, which is kind of crazy. I probably should have. I then spent another year or two editing it with help from my father, who is a retired writer. And I began submitting it to agents initially. I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of agent rejections for that novel. Nobody wanted it. I then submitted to every single publisher that would accept an unagented submission, and they all rejected it too. I decided what I really needed to do was write some short fiction to gain some street cred, and I figured short fiction would be much easier to sell. So I decided once I had a few short story sales, I'd try selling 88 again. So I wrote a bunch of short stories. I submitted them for about a year and got rejection after rejection. I had, over 100 rejection letters just for short stories. I was about to give up when I sold my first short story, Artificial Stupidity, to a magazine, a Canadian magazine called On Spec, which gave me hope. So I kept going. In the second year of short stories, I sold one more, and that was... the fuck was that? Intellectual Property. Yes. Sold that to the UK magazine, which I'm capping out on, of course. Anyway, Interzone. Ha! That was it. Sold that story to Interzone. Over the next year, I sold maybe half a dozen more stories to various markets. Then decided to make another attempt at selling 88. Had edited it some more. Spent time cleaning it up. Did some rewrites. Once again, submitted everywhere. Got a ton of rejections. And eventually it sold to a small a Canadian micro press called Five Rivers Publishing out of Fergus, Ontario, if I recall correctly. So the book sold about 32 copies over the next year or two. I'm pretty sure my mom bought most of those. And I learned a lot during the writing process, during the editing process. I worked mostly with an editor by the name of Barb Geiger. And she basically eviscerated my writing, eviscerated the story. She taught me about tense, about POV. Yeah. So I rewrote the entire book, changing it from present tense to past tense. And while that did suck some of the life out of the action scenes, it made the rest of the book much better. So 88 was published in 2013. I took everything I learned during that writing process and started working on another book. So I'm just because it's kind of amusing, I'm going to flip to the back of my copy of 88 here and read this little bit. It's about the author at the back. He is currently working on his second book, a dark fantasy novel of manifest delusion, and thinking about a sequel to 88. Anyone who knows me knows that second book turned into Beyond Redemption. That is another story for another video, and I will get to that at some point. The sequel to 88 was never written because I got caught up writing other stuff. Somewhere around 2016, the rights reverted from Five Rivers to myself, the rights for 88. And I did some more editing. I wrote a new chapter or two, I can't remember. And I self-published that novel as Ghosts of Tomorrow. But once again, that is a story for another day. So tune in again later, and we'll talk about the next book. I don't even know which one it's going to be yet. Maybe I'm going to do this in sort of chronological release order. Release order. Yeah, this is super slick. Or maybe I'll do it by some other metric. I don't know. Anyway, drop any questions. I'm always around. Take care.